The police sirens were getting closer. I could hear them echoing across the lake as I stood in my driveway, surrounded by boxes of evidence that would change everything. Corinne Mitchell stood 20 feet away, her phone still pressed to her ear, confident that she had finally won. She had called 911 claiming I was destroying property and threatening violence. None of it was true, but she did not care. For months, she had been making my life a living hell, trying to steal my grandfather's land through lies and intimidation. But as the patrol cars pulled up and the officers stepped out, I remained calm. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Corinne had no idea what was coming. She thought she was about to watch me get arrested. Instead, she was about to discover that everything she had built was about to crumble. The look on her face when she saw what I brought would haunt her forever. 3 months ago, I received a phone call that changed my life forever. My grandfather had passed away, and according to his will, I had inherited his property. I had no idea what that meant until the lawyer explained it to me. 50 acres of lakefront land, including an old cabin and untouched wilderness. My grandfather had never mentioned it during family gatherings. The drive to the property took me 2 hours through winding country roads. When I finally arrived, I could barely believe what I was seeing. The lake stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the sky and surrounding trees. The cabin sat on a small hill overlooking the water, weathered but solid. Tall grass swayed in the breeze, and I could hear birds singing in the distance. I walked through the property for hours, discovering hidden trails and forgotten clearings. This was not just land. This was a sanctuary. My grandfather had owned this piece of heaven for over 40 years, and somehow I had never known about it. The emotional weight of the inheritance hit me as I stood on the wooden dock, watching the sunset paint the water orange and gold. Inside the cabin, I found my grandfather's journal tucked away in an old wooden desk. The pages were filled with his careful handwriting, documenting years of battles with something called the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. As I read through his entries, anger began building in my chest. The HOA had been formed by wealthy newcomers who built luxury homes around the lake perimeter, and they wanted to control every property in the area. Corinne Mitchell's name appeared repeatedly in the journal entries. She was the HOA president, and according to my grandfather's notes, she had been sending threatening letters for years. The letters claimed my grandfather's property violated community standards. They demanded he remove old structures, maintain his landscaping to HOA specifications, and pay monthly fees for services he never requested. My grandfather had fought back with legal documentation proving his property predated the HOA by decades. He had water rights, mineral rights, and complete exemption from any association formed after his original purchase. But Corinne had not cared about legal facts. She had continued her harassment campaign until the day he died. The final entry in the journal was dated just 2 weeks before his death. My grandfather wrote that he was tired of fighting, but he would never give up the family land. He hoped that someday, someone in the family would continue the battle and restore the property to its former glory. Reading those words, I made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I would keep the property. I would honor my grandfather's memory by restoring the cabin and protecting the land he had loved. I had no idea that this decision would put me on a collision course with the most entitled, vindictive person I had ever encountered. Corinne Mitchell was about to learn that she had picked the wrong fight with the wrong family. 2 weeks later, I returned to the property with cleaning supplies and basic tools. I planned to spend the weekend clearing debris and assessing what repairs the cabin needed. I had just started unloading my truck when I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I turned around to see a woman in her 50s walking toward me with the confidence of someone who owned the entire lake. She was perfectly dressed in expensive casual clothes, her hair styled like she was heading to a country club meeting, but her expression was anything but friendly. She stopped about 10 feet away and crossed her arms, looking me up and down like I was some kind of criminal. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I am Karen Mitchell, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. You cannot be here without proper authorization." I set down the box I was carrying and faced her directly. "I am sorry, but I own this property. I inherited it from my grandfather." Karen's eyes narrowed. "That does not matter. All properties in this area are subject to HOA regulations. You have multiple violations that need to be addressed immediately." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my truck, the cabin, and even me personally. The clicking sound of her camera felt like an invasion of privacy. I could feel my blood pressure rising as she documented everything like she was gathering evidence for a court case. "Your structures are unsightly and not in compliance with community standards," Karen continued, still snapping photos. "The landscaping is completely unacceptable. Weeds, overgrown grass, and dead trees are bringing down property values for the entire neighborhood." I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "Ma'am, my property predates your HOA by decades. I have legal documentation proving that I am not subject to your regulations." Karen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everyone thinks they can ignore the rules, but this is a civilized community, and we will not tolerate property owners who refuse to maintain basic standards." She walked closer to the cabin, taking more photos and making notes on her phone. "You have 30 days to bring this property into compliance or face legal action. The association has lawyers, and we are not afraid to use them." I watched her circle my property like a predator marking territory. Every step she took felt like a violation. This was my land, my inheritance, my connection to my grandfather's memory. But Karen acted like she owned it. "I am also requiring you to pay 6 months of back fees," she said, typing something on her phone. "The previous owner never paid his association dues, and those debts transfer with the property." "My grandfather never agreed to join your association," I replied, my voice getting stronger. "He fought your illegal demands for years." Karen stopped typing and looked at me with pure hatred. "Your grandfather was a stubborn old man who refused to be a good neighbor. He made everyone's life more difficult with his selfishness. But he is gone now, and things are going to change." Hearing her insult my grandfather's memory was the final straw. I could feel my hands shaking with anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I think you need to leave my property now." Karen smiled coldly and held up her phone. "I have everything I need. You will be hearing from our lawyers very soon." As she walked away, she called back over her shoulder, "I am going to deal with this situation permanently. You can count on it." That night, I discovered that Karen had posted about me in several neighborhood Facebook groups. She called me a problem resident and a threat to community values. She shared the photos she had taken and encouraged other residents to report any suspicious activity around my property. I realized I was not just dealing with a difficult neighbor. I was facing someone who would use every tool at her disposal to destroy my life. Karen Mitchell had declared war, and she had no idea what she was about to unleash. The harassment began immediately. Within a week of my confrontation with Karen, I received 3 certified letters claiming various property violations. The first letter accused me of building structures without proper permits, despite my grandfather's legal documentation proving everything was built decades before any permit requirements existed. The second letter claimed my septic system was not up to code and demanded immediate inspection by a county-approved contractor. The third letter threatened fines for improper landscaping maintenance and failure to maintain community standards. Each letter was signed by Corinne Mitchell and included references to legal action if I did not comply within 30 days. But the letters were just the beginning. When I returned to the property the following weekend, I discovered that someone had placed orange cones across the dirt road leading to my cabin. A handwritten sign claimed the road was now a private HOA maintenance area and that unauthorized vehicles would be towed. I moved the cones and drove to my property, but the message was clear. Corinne was trying to block my access to my own land. I called the county road department and learned that the dirt road was actually a public easement that could not be blocked by private parties. But Corinne was counting on my ignorance of local laws to intimidate me into giving up. The next week brought a new level of harassment. I started noticing cars driving slowly past my property at odd hours. The same vehicles would circle the lake road multiple times, always slowing down when they passed my cabin. I later learned that Corinne had organized neighborhood safety patrols to monitor suspicious activity in the area. The safety patrols were actually neighbors who had been convinced that I was some kind of threat to their peaceful community. Corinne had been spreading rumors about me in her Facebook groups, claiming I was planning to turn the property into a commercial campground or hunting lodge. None of it was true, but fear spreads faster than facts in small communities. Then the city inspectors started showing up. First, it was a septic inspector who claimed he had received complaints about sewage odors coming from my property. After examining my system, he found no violations and seemed confused about why he had been called. A week later, an electrical inspector arrived to investigate reports of illegal wiring and fire hazards. Each inspection found nothing wrong, but the pattern was obvious. Corinne was making false complaints to every government agency she could think of, hoping one of them would find a violation she could use against me. The inspectors were professional and apologetic, but I could see the frustration in their eyes. They were being used as weapons in Corinne's personal war. The psychological warfare intensified when I started finding notes on my truck and cabin door. The notes were written in Corinne's distinctive handwriting, filled with passive-aggressive threats disguised as neighborly advice. "For your own safety, consider selling this property before winter," one note read. "The community is watching, and we do not forget troublemakers," said another. I installed a security camera to document the harassment, but Corinne was clever about avoiding direct confrontation. She would drive by slowly, taking photos with her phone, but never stepping onto my property where she could be accused of trespassing. She was building a case against me while making sure she could claim innocence if questioned. The breaking point came when I learned about Corinne's real estate connections. A neighbor who felt sorry for me quietly revealed that several property owners around the lake had been pressured into selling to developers who had close ties to Corinne's family. The pattern was always the same: harassment, legal threats, and finally, a below-market offer to solve everyone's problems. I realized that Corinne's campaign against me was not about property values or community standards. It was about money. She wanted my 50 acres of lakefront property, and she was willing to use fraud, intimidation, and abuse of government resources to get it. But she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated the descendant of a man who had fought her for years and never surrendered. My grandfather had documented everything, and now I had evidence of her escalating harassment. Corinne thought she was dealing with another victim who would eventually give up and sell. She had no idea that I was about to turn the tables and expose her entire operation. It was a Saturday morning in October when Karen made her most desperate move. I had driven to the property early to work on winterizing the cabin before the cold weather arrived. I was carrying supplies from my truck when I heard sirens approaching from the distance. Two police cars pulled into my driveway, and four officers stepped out with serious expressions on their faces. My heart started racing as I wondered what emergency had brought them to my property. Then I saw Corinne Mitchell walking toward the officers from the road, her phone in her hand and a satisfied smile on her face. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly," Corinne said, her voice filled with fake concern. "This man has been trespassing on HOA property and threatening residents. He refuses to follow community regulations and has been making threats against me personally." I stood frozen, watching this insane performance. Karen was pointing at me like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. The officers looked confused as they tried to understand what was happening. "Sir, we received a call about trespassing and disturbing the peace," one of the officers said to me. "Can you explain what you are doing here?" Before I could answer, Karen jumped in with more lies. "He has been violating multiple HOA restrictions and refuses to pay community fees. When I tried to discuss this with him civilly, he became hostile and aggressive." Karen reached into her purse and pulled out a folder filled with papers. "I have documentation showing that this property is subject to recent emergency HOA amendments. He has no legal right to be here without association approval." The documents looked official, but I knew they were fake. Karen had fabricated emergency amendments to try to fool the police into thinking she had legal authority over my property. The desperation in her scheme was obvious, but she was counting on the officers not understanding property law. I took a deep breath and reached for my own folder of documents. "Officers, I own this property. I inherited it from my grandfather, and I have all the legal paperwork to prove it." I handed them copies of the deed, the will, and my grandfather's original property survey. The officers examined the documents carefully while Corinne stood nearby, her confidence starting to waver. "Ma'am, these documents show that this gentleman owns this property," the lead officer said to Corinne. "His ownership predates any homeowners association by decades." Corinne's face turned red with fury. "That does not matter. Community standards apply to everyone. You need to arrest him for trespassing and threatening behavior." The officers exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they were dealing with someone who was not thinking rationally. Corinne had called 911 to report crimes that did not exist, wasting emergency resources on her personal vendetta. "Ma'am, there is no crime being committed here," the officer explained patiently. "This man has every right to be on his own property." Corinne completely lost control at that point. She started screaming about property values, undesirable elements, and her rights as an HOA president. She demanded that the officers arrest me anyway, claiming I was still violating community standards even if I owned the land. "I am calling the county supervisors," Corinne shrieked. "I am calling the state attorney general. This will be a federal case before I am finished." The officers remained professional, but I could see they were running out of patience. Corinne had wasted their time with a false emergency call, and now she was making increasingly irrational demands. After the police left, Corinne stood in my driveway for another 10 minutes, screaming about how I was ruining the neighborhood and destroying everyone's property values. She called me selfish, stubborn, and unfit to live in a civilized community. But as I watched her melt down, I realized something important. Corinne was desperate. Her harassment campaign was not working, and she was running out of options. The fake police call was her last desperate attempt to use government authority against me. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to defend myself against Corinne's attacks, I was going to go on the offensive. It was time to investigate exactly who Corinne Mitchell really was and expose the truth about her criminal behavior. The next Monday, I hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen. I had found him through an online search for investigators who specialized in HOA fraud and real estate scams. Marcus had handled similar cases before, and he assured me that Corinne's behavior followed a pattern he had seen many times. People like Corinne Mitchell prey on property owners who do not know their rights, Marcus explained during our first meeting. They use intimidation and fake legal authority to force people into compliance, but they always make mistakes, and those mistakes can be used against them. I gave Marcus copies of all my grandfather's documentation, Corinne's threatening letters, and the fake HOA amendments she had shown to the police. Within a week, Marcus called me with information that made my blood boil. Your HOA president has no legal authority to form an association on existing properties without owner consent, Marcus said. The Pine Lake Homeowners Association was never properly incorporated, and most of the legal documents Corinne has been using are fraudulent. Marcus had discovered that Corinne had been collecting monthly fees from neighbors for years, claiming the money was for road maintenance, lake management, and legal expenses. But there was no legitimate HOA bank account, no board of directors, and no legal structure to support her claims. "Where is the money going?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Into Corinne's personal bank account," Marcus replied. "She has been embezzling thousands of dollars from your neighbors while claiming to represent their interests." But the financial fraud was just the beginning. Marcus had also discovered that Corinne's husband, David Mitchell, worked for the county zoning department. This created a massive conflict of interest that explained how Corinne had been able to coordinate harassment through government inspectors. David Mitchell has been using his position to fast-track complaint investigations against property owners who oppose his wife, Marcus explained. He has been sharing confidential information about pending cases and helping Corinne target vulnerable residents. The corruption ran deeper than I had imagined. Corinne had been using her husband's government connections to abuse public resources for her private vendetta. Every fake inspection, every harassment campaign, every false emergency call had been coordinated through inside information. Marcus had also found multiple complaints filed against Corinne with the state attorney general's office. Other property owners had tried to expose her illegal activities, but their individual complaints had been ignored or dismissed. Corinne had been operating her scam for years, confident that no one would be able to stop her. "The key to stopping Corinne is documentation," Marcus said. "We need to gather evidence of her embezzlement, her fraudulent HOA claims, and her abuse of government resources. Once we have everything compiled, we can present it to law enforcement and watch her entire operation collapse." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus worked with me to build an airtight case against Corinne. We obtained bank records showing her embezzlement, recorded phone calls where she made false claims about her legal authority, and documented every instance of harassment she had directed at me and other property owners. The evidence was overwhelming. Corinne had been running a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association. She had been stealing money, filing false government complaints, and using her husband's position to intimidate innocent people. She had thought she was untouchable because no one had ever challenged her systematically. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Karen had been targeting elderly property owners specifically because she believed they would be less likely to fight back. My grandfather had been one of her primary victims, and his stress from dealing with her harassment had likely contributed to his declining health. Knowing that Karen had essentially tortured my grandfather in his final years filled me with a cold rage. This was no longer about defending my property rights. This was about delivering justice for every person Karen had victimized over the years. Marcus and I prepared 3 boxes of evidence documenting Karen's crimes. We had financial records, recorded conversations, fake legal documents, and testimony from neighbors who had been intimidated into silence. We had everything needed to destroy Karen's criminal operation and send her to prison. The final phase of our plan was simple. I would return to my property for a routine maintenance visit, and Karen would inevitably call the police with another false emergency. But this time, when the officers arrived, I would be ready with evidence that would change everything. I chose a sunny Wednesday morning for the final confrontation. I loaded my truck with the usual maintenance supplies, but I also packed 3 boxes of evidence that would end Karen's reign of terror forever. Marcus had helped me organize everything perfectly, with clear documentation of every crime Karen had committed. I drove to the property slowly, knowing that Karen's neighborhood spy network would report my arrival within minutes. Sure enough, I had barely started unloading my truck when I heard the familiar sound of her voice on the phone, calling 911 with another fabricated emergency. "I need police at Pine Lake Road immediately," Karen was saying, her voice loud enough for me to hear from across the lake. "The problem resident is back, and he is destroying property and making threats. This is an emergency situation." I continued unloading my truck calmly, setting the 3 boxes of evidence on the ground next to my cabin. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and I felt surprisingly peaceful as I waited for the police to arrive. 2 patrol cars pulled into my driveway 15 minutes later, followed by a county sheriff's vehicle. Karen was right behind them, practically running to keep up as the officers approached my property. She had dressed up for the occasion, wearing her most expensive outfit and carrying a folder of fake documents. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," Karen said, breathing hard from her rush to reach us. "This man has been violating court orders and threatening residents. He needs to be arrested immediately." The lead officer looked at me with tired eyes. I could tell he recognized me from the previous incident and was not thrilled to be dealing with another Karen Mitchell emergency call. "Sir, we have received multiple reports about property destruction and threatening behavior," the officer said. "Can you explain what you are doing here today?" I smiled and gestured toward the boxes of evidence. "Officer, I am maintaining my own property just like always, but I think you need to see what I brought with me today." Karen's eyes fixed on the boxes for the first time, and I watched her confident expression change to confusion. She had been expecting to see me arrested, not presenting evidence to law enforcement. "What is in those boxes?" the officer asked. "Evidence of criminal fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of government resources," I replied, opening the first box. "Evidence that Karen Mitchell has been running an illegal scheme for years." I handed the officer a folder containing bank records showing Karen's embezzlement of HOA funds. "This shows that Mrs. Mitchell has been stealing money from neighbors while claiming to represent a legitimate homeowners association." Karen's face went white as she saw the financial documents. Those are private records. You had no right to obtain them. These are public records obtained through legal channels, I continued, opening the second box. This folder contains documentation proving that the Pine Lake Homeowners Association was never properly incorporated and has no legal authority to regulate any property. The officer examined the documents while Corinne stood frozen, finally understanding that her entire operation was being exposed. I could see panic starting to build in her eyes as she realized the scope of evidence I had gathered. This third box contains recorded conversations where Mrs. Mitchell makes false claims about her legal authority and admits to coordinating harassment campaigns against property owners, I said, opening the final box. Corinne found her voice and started screaming. "This is all lies. I am the victim here. He has been harassing me for months." But her protests only made her look more guilty. The officers were examining evidence of systematic criminal behavior, and Corinne's hysteria was confirming everything they were seeing. "Ma'am, we need to discuss these allegations with you," the sheriff said to Corinne. "You may want to contact an attorney." That was when David Mitchell's car pulled into the driveway. Corinne's husband had obviously been called when the police arrived, but he had not expected to find his wife being confronted with evidence of her crimes. David took one look at the documents spread across the hood of the patrol car and immediately stepped away from his wife. "I want to make it clear that I had no knowledge of any illegal activities," he said quickly. "David, you have to help me," Corinne pleaded, but her husband was already walking back to his car. He knew that his government job was in jeopardy, and he was not going to sacrifice his career to protect Corinne's criminal schemes. Corinne's breakdown was complete. She collapsed to her knees in my driveway, sobbing and screaming about how everyone was conspiring against her. The woman who had terrorized me and my neighbors for years had been reduced to a pathetic criminal caught in her own web of lies. The officers spent another hour examining the evidence and taking statements. When they finally loaded Corinne into the back of a patrol car, she was still insisting that she was the victim and that I was the criminal. But the evidence spoke for itself. Corinne Mitchell was going to face charges for fraud, embezzlement, filing false police reports, and conspiracy. Her husband would face ethics violations and likely lose his county job. The fake HOA would be dissolved, and the neighbors would get their money back. As the police cars drove away with Corinne in custody, I stood on my grandfather's property and felt a peace I had not experienced in months. Justice had finally been served. The next 6 months brought a cascade of consequences that completely dismantled Corinne's criminal operation. She was formally charged with 12 counts of fraud, embezzlement of over $40,000, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The district attorney called it one of the most elaborate HOA scams they had ever prosecuted. Corinne's husband David lost his county job within 2 weeks of her arrest. The ethics investigation revealed that he had been sharing confidential information and fast-tracking complaint investigations to support his wife's harassment campaigns. His 20-year career in government service ended in disgrace, and he faced his own criminal charges for abuse of office. The fake Pine Lake Homeowners Association was officially dissolved by court order. A forensic accountant traced every dollar Corinne had stolen from the neighbors, and the court ordered full restitution. Families who had been paying illegal fees for years finally got their money back, along with interest and damages. The most satisfying part of Corinne's downfall was watching her luxury home go into foreclosure. Without her embezzled income and her husband's government salary, Corinne could not afford the mortgage payments on the massive house she had used to project wealth and authority. The same property values she had obsessed over for years were now working against her. I started restoration work on my grandfather's cabin immediately after Corinne's arrest. The project became a neighborhood effort as grateful residents volunteered to help with construction and landscaping. People who had been intimidated into silence for years were finally free to be good neighbors without fear of Corinne's retaliation. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived across the lake, brought me homemade cookies and told me how Corinne had harassed her for years about her flower garden. Mr. Rodriguez, a veteran who owned a small cabin near mine, explained how Corinne had tried to force him to remove his American flag because it was not regulation size for the fake HOA. Every story I heard made me more grateful that I had stood up to Corinne's bullying. She had been terrorizing innocent people for years, using fear and intimidation to control an entire community. My decision to fight back had freed everyone from her tyranny. The restoration of my grandfather's property became a labor of love. I repaired the cabin's roof, rebuilt the dock, and cleared the overgrown trails that led through the woods. Every improvement honored my grandfather's memory and reclaimed the natural beauty that Corinne had tried to destroy with her obsession for control. I also discovered that my grandfather had been right about the property's conservation value. The 50 acres contained rare wetland habitats and served as a wildlife corridor for deer, birds, and other animals. I worked with the state conservation department to establish a small nature preserve on the back 40 acres, ensuring that the land would be protected forever. The nature preserve was dedicated in my grandfather's honor, with a small plaque recognizing his decades of environmental stewardship. The ceremony was attended by neighbors, conservation officials, and even some of the police officers who had responded to Corinne's fake emergency calls. Everyone wanted to celebrate the transformation of conflict into community benefit. Corinne's trial took place the following spring, and I testified about the harassment campaign she had directed against me and my grandfather. The judge was clearly disgusted by the evidence of systematic fraud and abuse of elderly victims. Corinne was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to all her victims. As I watched Corinne being led away in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction in her personal destruction. But I was proud that her criminal behavior had finally been exposed and that justice had been served for all the people she had hurt over the years. The property became my weekend retreat, a place where I could escape the stress of city life and connect with nature. I spent summer evenings on the rebuilt dock, watching the sunset paint the lake in brilliant colors. I could almost feel my grandfather's presence during those quiet moments, and I knew he would be proud of how I had honored his legacy. The fight against Corinne Mitchell had changed me in ways I never expected. I had discovered inner strength I did not know I possessed, and I had learned that standing up to bullies can protect entire communities. Most importantly, I had preserved a piece of family history that might otherwise have been lost forever. Every time I unlock the cabin door and step onto the porch, I remember the scared, confused person I was when I first inherited this property. Corinne Mitchell had tried to intimidate me into giving up my grandfather's land, but instead she had awakened a fighter who refused to back down from injustice. The lake is peaceful now, free from Corinne's harassment and threats. It has become what my grandfather always intended it to be, a sanctuary where family and nature can flourish together.